Hey guys, tonight we're slipping in quietly into one of the softest corners of Renaissance Italy, where snails were not a menu item, but a symbol of grace, refinement, and, in some very intense cases, high-stakes social one-upmanship. Imagine this. You're standing in a dew-touched garden just outside Florence. The hedges are clipped into classical shapes, and the moonlight glints off marble cherubs holding fountains. But nestled on a lace napkin in the gloved palm of a noblewoman's hand is a snail. Not just any snail. This one is brushed clean, dusted with ground rose petal, and being fed a paste of grape pulp using something that looks suspiciously like a spoon stolen from a dollhouse. You probably won't survive this. Not from fear, or action, or drama, but from the sheer lack of urgency. This is the kind of night that seeps into your bones like warm olive oil. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You blink slowly as a perfumed breeze passes over a pergola. Florence in the mid-1400s is a place where even the pets had lineage, and somehow, through a mixture of art, science, and garden gossip, the humble snail. Yes, the moist little spiral on your grandma's walkway became the Renaissance equivalent of an iPhone in a jewel case. These weren't just wild snails caught in a hedge. Oh no, these were bred, grown in purpose-built lumicariums, tiny domed greenhouses set up in shaded corners of noble estates. Inside, snails were housed in elaborate boxes lined with moss, lavender, and cooled marble tiles. Some were even outfitted with miniature hammocks woven from silk threads. If you believe the diary of one bored apprentice to the house of Albizzi, you trail your fingers along a carved stone bench as you approach a group of noblewomen, gathered beneath a trellis where muscat grapes hang like sleepy chandeliers. They're not gossiping about lovers or fashion. They're murmuring about shell tone, ivory, but with a warm pink base. One says, holding up her snail to catch the golden light. Another sighs, mine is so shy. He won't peek his horns unless I hum. You watch as a silk pouch is gently opened. It's embroidered with lilies, lined in velvet. Inside, a single snail, resting as if it's royalty on a pillow. Its name is Giulietta. And yes, she has a name. Most of them do. There were naming conventions. One 1471 bestiary notes that good names for female snails include Isabetta, Clarina, or anything suggestive of softness and wisdom. Male snails, predictably, were often named after philosophers or local bishops. Now and then, a boy in livery would trot out from the villa kitchens holding a chilled silver tray. On it, delicacies for the gastropods, thinly shaved cucumber, fermented fig paste, and once even a tiny dollop of mashed pear mixed with saffron. One chronicler noted that during the summer of 1469, a single noble household could go through 18 pounds of produce for the snails alone. Why? Historians still argue whether this was about genuine affection or simply performance. Was it love, or was it just another Renaissance arms race, where collecting the rarest shell spiral became the new collecting antique coins? You lean in as one girl, no older than 14, beams proudly. My Enrico's shell is triple-ringed, she says, holding him up like a crown jewel. It means he was born during a thunderstorm. You can't help but chuckle, even now. In an age where we track astrological signs via apps, something about that idea feels ancient and cozy, assigning cosmic meaning to a slow-moving blob with a spiral on its back. And the gear? Oh, the gear. Handcrafted snail saddles. Not for riding, don't be ridiculous, but for decoration. Tiny, gilded filigree adornments pressed into thin leather and fastened with silk thread to the shell. One infamous workshop in Verona became known for designing snail cloaks, which were capes made from lace and glass beads, secured with a single pin that sat just above the shell's apex. A Renaissance zoologist, or at least a man who claimed to be one, and spent an inordinate amount of time in taverns, once tried to classify the different emotional expressions of snails. He published a handwritten pamphlet called Les Sfumature del Gusto, The Shades of Slime, in which he insisted that a curled tentacle meant joy and a recoiled foot meant jealousy. No one believed him. But his sketch of a melancholy snail became quite popular among the more poetic youths of Florence. Evenings like this were the norm. Quiet, humid, scented with thyme and dripping fruits, and in that hush, where cicadas pulse and wine sits unfinished on the lip of a marble table, you begin to understand why people fell in love with these creatures. They required patience. They never barked or chased things. They didn't die dramatically. They just existed, slowly, softly, spiraling through a world in a hurry. And if that isn't the perfect bedtime metaphor, you don't know what is. You wander deeper into the garden estate, past hedgerows trained into swooping arabesques, and beneath awnings woven with dried lemon balm. Laughter flutters out from an open loggia where nobles have gathered not for music, not for chess, but for something far stickier. Tonight is a snail showcase hosted by none other than a young Lorenzo de' Medici himself, just 17, but already fluent in Latin, diplomacy, and snail presentation etiquette. The scene before you unfolds like a Baroque fever dream. A long, polished table stretches beneath a canopy of grapevines, and on it, tiny engraved plaques mark the names and breeds of each participant's prized mollusk. You drift toward the edge, eyes adjusting to the flicker of torchlight, and see what looks like a slow-motion fashion show. Each snail has been fitted with an ornamental shell cap. Some are crusted with seed pearls, others delicately painted with family crests in lapis and vermilion. The most extravagant among them, a snail named Cosimo, whose entire shell has been gilded, painstakingly brushed with gold leaf and sealed with beeswax, making him glisten like a Fabergé egg with antennae. And yes, someone is fanning him. Lorenzo steps forward, dressed in silk the shade of pomegranate skin, a playful smirk tugging at his mouth. He announces the judging categories: symmetry of spiral, shell coloration, gait elegance. Yes, there's a category for that. And temperament specifically, how well the snail reacts to being gently prodded with a rosemary sprig. A hush falls over the crowd. You lean on a marble column as a herald begins the introductions. Each snail is lifted gently by its handler, usually a servant wearing gloves and presented under a magnifying crystal. One guest audibly gasps at a snail whose shell bears 3 natural stripes, one white, one deep ochre, and one strangely silver-gray. The crowd murmurs. A friar crosses himself. The owner, a young nobleman with a beard too thin for his face, explains he was born on the same night as the comet. People nod solemnly. There's talk of divine signs, of astrology, of snails bearing omens in the curves of their shell growth. Historians still argue whether this fascination was rooted in pagan superstition or simply the era's obsession with pattern and harmony. Either way, no one questions it, not here. A breeze drifts in, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from the nearby kitchen. But no one's eating. They're too focused on Lorenzo's commentary. He gestures to a particularly large snail with a deep olive shell and announces, "This one, dear friends, descended from the noble mollusks of Siena, trained on limestone, kissed only by morning dew. A few ladies swoon. One faints possibly from her corset, possibly from excitement. Of course, controversy follows. A Florentine rival accuses the Sienese owner of shell polishing and illegal enhancement if done with lemon peel. A hush descends, and a judge, a stony woman in austere robes, steps forward with a damp cloth and wipes the shell. No residue. The crowd exhales. The snail stays in. Your favorite moment comes just after. A young girl in a pale green gown releases her snail onto the table without adornment, save for a single ivy tendril. The snail moves slowly, deliberately, and comes to rest in a perfect spiral on the judging plate. The crowd, for once, falls silent. Lorenzo raises a hand and says, softly, "Elegance in simplicity. It wins the temperament category." Of course it does, but not everyone plays fair. Later, near the wine table, you overhear 2 handlers whispering about a shell painting scheme. A man was caught dusting powdered lapis into a snail's grooves just before judging. The accused, a Venetian diplomat, His defense: it enhances what's already divine. He's disqualified anyway. Snail shows, it turns out, are serious business. Historians like to pretend this was all just noble nonsense, but tucked between those gold-framed windows and columned halls were layers of meaning. In a world obsessed with order, symmetry, and microcosms of the universe, snails represented the ideal form spiral. Fibonacci made flesh, or rather, slime. You glance back toward Lorenzo. He holds up the winning snail with a reverence normally reserved for relics. See, he tells the audience how it neither hurries nor hesitates. It trusts the path beneath it. That quote later appears in a love letter he writes to a woman who refuses to marry him. The snail is immortalized. The romance, less so. Still, tonight, beneath the velvet sky and flickering lamps, it feels like the center of the world. You shuffle quietly from the glowing terrace and into the cooler interior of the villa, down a tiled hallway that smells of rosemary oil and old paper. A door creaks open, and you step into a shadowy apothecary's chamber, part pantry, part science lab, part sanctuary for anyone who believes that the body's balance can be restored with just the right goo scraped from the back of a garden snail. A hunched man in a doublet so stained it's practically a color chart is weighing something translucent and glistening on a brass scale. He doesn't look up. He's whispering to himself. The words sound like a prayer, but it's actually a dosage calculation. The snail, meanwhile, is still alive. Yes, this is the world of Renaissance snail medicine, where slime was sold by the ounce, stored in glass ampules, and believed to be the cure for nearly everything. Ulcers, coughs, melancholy, love sickness, hysteria, of course, and even, bizarrely, memory loss. This particular apothecary is named Matteo, and he's been quietly famous in Florence ever since his Lummucca syrup allegedly restored the voice of a bishop who'd gone mute during a sermon. Historians still argue whether the bishop had simply choked on a grapeseed, but Matteo swears it was the snail goo, twice boiled, once sung over, he says, indicating the bubbling copper pot where three sluggish creatures are being steamed like tiny monks in a spa retreat. The air is thick with herbal smoke sage, dried violet, something vaguely like licorice. And as you settle on a wooden stool, Matteo leans in and shows you his prized ingredient. It's not just any slime, it's morning slime. That's right, collected only before sunrise, when the snails are freshest and their grief is still unspoken. He says that last part with a straight face. According to fringe Renaissance healers, morning slime was spiritually lighter, having not yet been contaminated by daily bitterness. One Venetian alchemist even attempted to map emotional states to snail secretions, claiming that sorrow produced thicker trails, while joy yielded almost crystalline droplet patterns. No one quite replicated his work, but his manuscript De Lacrima Molluscorum still survives in part because the illustrations are weirdly adorable. Matteo dips a reed quill into the vial and writes out a prescription for heartbreak. He mutters, handing it to you. You read it sideways. Snail slime, violet syrup. Whisper the name once nightly. No more than a sigh. You blink. Did that just rhyme? He goes on to show you his snail-infused balms, one for cracked skin, one for dreaming a mix of crushed lavender petals and snail mucin, and one most curiously for improving memory. It slows the thoughts, he explains, so they can be arranged. You ask if it actually works. He nods solemnly, then forgets where he put the jar. A knock on the door. A woman in noble robes enters, head bowed. She's not here for herbs. She's here for Salvatore. Salvatore is a snail, or rather, her snail. He's been feeling detached. Won't come out of his shell. She's worried. Matteo takes the matter seriously. He examines the shell, checks for fungal spots, inspects the foot, and finally gives a low hum. He's grieving, he says, perhaps a move to a cooler shelf, and talk to him. She nods, misty-eyed. He liked the madrigals, she whispers. I'll sing them again. As she leaves, Matteo turns to you with an expression halfway between pride and exhaustion. They think I'm mad, he says. but they keep coming. They always come back. You glance at his wall of hanging shells, tiny tags beneath each one with names, dates, and diagnoses. A sort of slimy patient record archive. You may laugh now, but in 1487, the Florentine Republic issued a tax exemption for registered apothecaries who offered snail remedies, citing them as critical for the treatment of seasonal imbalance. A few years later, the Medici court physician published a tract titled On the Sacred Spiral, blending Hippocratic theory with some very slippery metaphors. One mainstream historian believes that the true appeal of snail-based healing was tactile, the act of touching something slow, soft, and vulnerable was soothing in a world that often felt brutal and fast. Another suggests it was all economic. Snails were everywhere, cheap to keep, and infinitely brandable either way. You sit quietly in Matteo's apothecary, surrounded by the clinking of vials, the slow bubble of sap, and the whisper of shell on tile as Salvatore makes his slow descent toward a dish of fennel mash. Outside, bells begin to chime softly for the evening hour. And here in this dusky chamber, among the bottles and myths and morning glisten, you begin to wonder what else we've forgotten to believe in. You slip back into the garden, but this time through the servants' path, where the hedges grow wild, and the air smells like thyme and laundry starch. It's quieter here, and yet somehow livelier. Laughter drifts from an open window above you, and as you look up, you catch the edge of candlelight reflecting off a small mirror. Inside, a group of young noblewomen are hosting what can only be described as a shell salon. Yes, a snail-themed salon. You step lightly through the courtyard arch and into the back parlor. The room is warm with bodies, powdered wigs, and expectation. Every cushion is occupied. Women lean forward on their elbows, fingers clasped in contemplation, as a girl named Benedetta holds up a snail shell and says with deep conviction, "Counterclockwise spirals make the mind expand. Clockwise ones are a sign of submission." A collective hum of agreement, or perhaps polite confusion, moves through the circle. This is not a gathering of casual fanciers. These women have opinions, collections, charts. A pile of parchment sits near the hearth, each page filled with obsessive crosshatch diagrams of shell whorls and growth ridges. There's even a hand-drawn color wheel labeled Emotional Palettes of the Helix. You inch closer, eyes catching the glint of snail shell brooches worn like family crests. These are hand-carved and dyed soft lilacs, jade greens, speckled browns. One woman, a sharp-nosed Milanese widow in a gown that rustles like dry parchment, declares, "Spots are vulgar. Only peasants prize spots." Another claps back, "Spots are natural, and so are peasants." You half expect someone to start throwing snails like gloves in a duel. The debate turns heated. Someone brings up a notorious incident at last season's equinox gathering in Verona, where a guest arrived wearing dyed snail shells on her sleeves. Dyed with crushed beetroot. The scandal caused a brief schism in the society, with half the members declaring color enhancements sacrilege, while others, primarily younger enthusiasts, argued for creative evolution. Historians still argue whether this marked the beginning of the decline of the so-called snail aesthetic movement, or merely its inevitable diversification. Meanwhile, Benedetta unfurls a velvet wrap, revealing her collection of seasonal shells. She's grouped them by mood and offers one to the group for silent contemplation. "This one," she says, pointing to a pale blush-pink specimen with ridges like pressed linen, "was from the week I turned 17. It rained every morning, and my cousin eloped with a lute player." The group nods in sympathy. You lean back against the plaster wall, amused, but a little in awe. The room feels like a cross between a literary salon, a fashion workshop, and a slow-motion seance. One girl offers up a theory that snails, being spiral-formed, collect dreams. She claims if you sleep with one near your ear, you'll absorb its memories. Another swears she did just that and dreamed of dew and grass and thunder under stone. It's all a bit absurd, but also kind of lovely. A servant arrives with refreshments. Tiny lavender cakes shaped like snails. Of course, honey water in snail-handled cups, and candied violets dusted in what might be powdered pearl. The women nibble delicately, careful not to smudge their gloves. No one raises their voice. Even the debates, heated as they are, have the gentle pace of moss growing. Somewhere near the fireplace, two sisters compare the shell patterns of their respective pets, debating whether asymmetry is a flaw or a symbol of rebellious spirit. One of them says, "My Donatella has a crooked ridge, but she's brave." Her voice softens on that last word. It's not just a snail, it's a reflection. That's the real point, isn't it? These salons weren't just about aesthetics. They were mirrors, safe places to express longing, grief, pride, rebellion, all projected onto the shell of a slow, silent creature that couldn't contradict you. One that just was no agenda, no expectations, just a spiral of self-containment. There's a theory, admittedly fringe, that the salons helped shape proto-feminist thought in northern Italy. That these gentle, contemplative gatherings became spaces where women could philosophize, critique, and even organize under the entirely non-threatening banner of snail appreciation. Whether or not that's true, you can feel something special in the room, something slower than time, something deeper than decoration. Eventually, the gathering winds down. The fire crackles, and you hear someone sigh softly. A girl cradles her snail in her palm, whispering. You listen better than any of them. She presses a kiss to the shell and tucks it away into its velvet pouch. And in that moment, you realize these salons were never about the snails. Not really. They were about finding something, anything that made people feel seen. You linger in the hush of the emptied salon as wax drips slow tears down candle stems, but something pulls you onward, something quieter, somehow more intimate than all the whispering debates about swirls and symmetry. You follow a narrow staircase up to the painter's loft, where a single window lets in pale moonlight that turns the floorboards silver. There's no music here, no lace, no velvet-wrapped pouches, just brushes, oils, and a half-finished portrait of a duchess with a snail on her glove. She's not smiling. The painter leans forward, squinting into the curl of the snail's shell as if it holds the final brushstroke he needs. His name is Giulio, and he's been commissioned to immortalize Lady Serafina of Padua, whose real passion is, of course, the rare alpine-banded snail resting on her silk-covered hand. You step softly around canvases stacked against the wall. Most of them are portraits. All of them include snails. One, a Madonna with child and gastropod. Another, a reclining nobleman with a snail crawling languidly across his collarbone. In each, the snail is not a footnote, it's the focus. The creature is rendered with as much care as the subject's eyes. Do you know how long it takes? Giulio murmurs without looking at you. To paint a snail's shell with dignity, his tone is part reverent, part resentful. They think it's an accessory, a prop, but it's a mirror. Look at her face. He gestures toward Lady Serafina. Look again. You do. She isn't posing. She's waiting. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of snails in portraiture was symbolic or simply fashionable. Giulio says, carefully mixing a hue the color of old parchment, they debate fertility, humility, divine geometry, and death. But I say, look how still she holds it. That's love. Or something close enough to haunt her? He pauses. She requested that I darken the snail's stripe. Says it makes him look more contemplative. In Renaissance Italy, portraiture was more than status. It was story. Every thread, every background leaf, every trinket was deliberate. And snails, strange as it sounds, became powerful signals. A golden shell might signal wealth. A wild snail untamed, unadorned was a nod to the natural self. A slow creature in a fast world, clinging to its own spiral truth. One surviving portrait from 1474 features a widow with her hand resting on a snail nestled in a silver bowl. The caption beneath it, added later, reads, "Time is the only thread I trust." Another shows a boy holding a snail in a locket case, gaze distant, lips pursed. The family records say the snail was the last gift from a sister who died of a fever. The locket, her sewing kit. Back in the studio, Giulio has now dipped his smallest brush, a single hair tool, into a dot of green gold paint and is working along the snail's shell, tracing its spiral with the patience of someone who has stared too long at truths too slow to speak back. You sit on a low stool beside him, He tells you that snail portraiture paid more bills than saints ever did. One Medici cousin ordered 5 different paintings of the same snail from 5 different artists, just to compare interpretations. One gave it a halo, he adds, rolling his eyes. Snails, he explains, were unpredictable subjects. Unlike dogs, they didn't pose. Unlike birds, they didn't flutter dramatically. They moved slowly, decisively, and then stopped. And yet, the very act of capturing that stillness became an obsession. It's like painting fog, he says, but slower and wetter. He offers you a look at his sketchbook. Dozens of studies of shell angles, foot textures, antenna placement. One page is just labeled mood, aloof. He turns back to his canvas. The Duchess's snail is almost complete now, its whorled form catching the candlelight in layered hues of amber and wine. It gleams against the matte backdrop like something halfway between sacred and silly. And then Giulio speaks one final thought. They come here asking for portraits of themselves, but they stare longest at the snail. It's true, because in that tiny spiral is everything they won't say. Their boredom, their longing, their need to be seen, but gently, without spectacle, without expectation, just slowly. You descend the painter's stairwell just as the morning mist begins curling into the villa's outer walkways. A low fog settles like spun sugar across the marble pavers, and from somewhere nearby comes the faintest sound of tiny wheels squeaking, followed by a grunt of concentration. You follow the noise. Around the corner, near the stables but far too early for horses, you find a young servant carefully pushing what looks like a miniature chariot, but not for people, not even for dolls. It's a snail carriage, and not just one, a full procession of them, lined up like an absurd parade of jewelry boxes on axles. Each snail has been gently placed at the front of a tiny custom-built cart crafted from walnut shell halves, silver thread reins, and little wheels made of bone or tortoise shell. A few even have banners. One bears the Medici crest in dyed silk no bigger than a thumbprint. Another has pom-poms, actual pom-poms, on a snail. The boy pauses when he sees you watching, a little embarrassed. They like the air, he mutters, clearly repeating something he's been told. It wakes them up. You kneel beside the display. One snail larger than the rest, with a delicate shimmer to its shell, moves with deliberate pride. His cart is gilded at the edges, with a pin-sized lantern swinging at the side. Inside the cart, nothing. Pure symbolism. That snail is the procession. The carts themselves are remarkable, crafted by artisans who usually make devotional miniatures or reliquaries. They're absurdly ornate for something meant to be dragged through a patch of lettuce. Gold filigree, stained glass insets, velvet cushions. It's rumored that one noblewoman paid a Venetian craftsman 3 florins for a custom snail chaise, a reclining litter with mother-of-pearl siding. Historians still debate whether that commission ever existed, or if it was just Renaissance satire. Either way, the blueprints survive in an old codex now housed in Turin. Back in the courtyard, the young servant lifts a snail carefully and places it on a starting line of powdered chalk, not for racing, but for the daily promenade. Each snail is meant to drag its carriage across a small marble track lined with fresh herbs. Rosemary, thyme, and marjoram create a maze of scents, and the snails are left to wander like royalty, choosing their route. You watch as one of them gets distracted by a violet bloom. It veers off course entirely, disappearing into a shaded planter. No one minds. You're told this was originally a training routine. The idea was to get the snails used to movement, to stimulate circulation though. What that meant to 15th century naturalists is unclear, and, perhaps most importantly, to entertain visiting guests. And, oh, did it entertain! Letters from the time describe elaborate snail promenades held during feast days. Guests would wager on which snail would reach a specific herb first, not based on speed, of course, but on aesthetic proximity. In short, which snail would gracefully choose the correct scent. One chronicler writes, "A certain Giovanni won a silver ring when his snail was the only one to reject rosemary. It is too bold a scent," he said. The judges agreed. There's something deeply silly about it, but also, again, deeply human. In a world filled with plague, political betrayal, and the occasional papal poisoning. Watching a snail slowly drag a gilded carriage over time leaves was, arguably, the healthiest form of escapism available. As the morning brightens, another servant appears with what looks like a spool of golden thread. He begins tying small garlands made of dried mint blossoms and rose petals onto the rears of the carts. For festivity, he explains. You nod. Of course, the favorite snail among the staff, it turns out, is named Erminio. He's massive, shell like aged ivory, moves like a gondola through fog. His cart is simple, just varnished wood with a single carved acorn at the back. But he has presence. One of the cooks swears he won't cross rosemary unless it's been sung over first. You watch him hesitate at the edge of the track. Someone begins humming. He moves forward. Historians still argue whether the whole snail cart phenomenon was a widespread trend or just an isolated fad among the upper Florentine elite. Records suggest Milanese nobles mocked the practice, but Venice leaned in. There are sketches in the margins of merchant ledgers showing snails and gondolas. One even has a snail race held on a dinner table. With ramps made from folded menus, you lean back against the stone wall and let the absurdity of it all settle around you. This little moment, the care, the color, the quiet pride in something so small, says more about Renaissance gentility than 1,000 treatises on courtly conduct. The carts are now neatly lined up again. A few snails sleep, a few press on, seeking dandelion or just purpose. And in the stillness of the courtyard, surrounded by the faint scent of mint and the tick-tick of wooden wheels, you start to understand it wasn't just about the snails, it was about control, ritual, comfort, beauty, and maybe, just maybe, it was about joy. You drift from the courtyard through a narrow passageway cooled by thick stone walls, where the air grows heavier and the laughter fades behind you. It's quieter here, more reverent, the kind of silence that sticks to the skin. Eventually, you push open a creaking door and enter what appears to be a small monastic library, its shelves bowed under the weight of dust, vellum, and snail-related moral quandaries. Yes, you've arrived at the heart of a theological dilemma. Can one love a snail too much? The monks here are not your average copyists or scholars. They are part of a lesser-known order, the Order of St. Gallus the Humble, whose rule emphasizes slowness, reflection, and silence. So naturally, some among them became extremely attached to snails, too attached. One friar, Fra Bartolomeo, leans over a parchment scroll, brow furrowed. He's illustrating a passage from the Liber Molluscorum, a curious manuscript containing everything from mollusk anatomy to moral parables involving slugs. The snail, he tells you, is a creature of restraint. It carries its home, speaks not, desires little, a monk in miniature, and yet, not everyone in the monastery agrees. There's an ongoing debate heated by monastic standards about whether keeping pet snails as companions is spiritually enriching or dangerously indulgent. A small group, calling themselves the Shell Guard, argue that naming your snail after a saint and feeding it fig mash from a carved spoon may distract one's heart from divine matters. Others, the spiralists, insist that to care deeply for something so fragile is an act of God's love in itself. Historians still argue whether this split was formalized or remained an internal squabble, but records show that at least one monk was reprimanded in 1482 for excessive displays of affection toward a particular gastropod named Lucia. Yes, that's in writing. Somewhere in the Florentine ecclesiastical archives is a footnote about snail cuddling. You take a seat near the tiled hearth as a third monk. Father Ugo recites from memory a passage. Blessed is the creature that moves without ambition. It's unclear whether he's talking about the snail or his superior. You glance at a nearby wooden table. On it, a hand-drawn chart labeled Signs of Molluscan Pride. It includes refusal to retreat into shell, even possible gluttony, over-polished shell, ill vanity, frequent appearances in portraits, flirtation with idolatry. Somewhere else, You see a marginal note scrawled in red ink. Snails are not sacraments. Someone has added in pencil, but what if they're metaphors? They've clearly been at this for a while. You walk along the rows of scrolls and find a curious one bound in indigo linen. Inside, a list of recommended penances for those who exalt the gastropod beyond its station. One suggests sleeping without cushions for a week. Another, more bizarre, proposes replacing your snail with a pebble and seeing if your heart notices. You imagine a monk holding a rock and whispering bedtime prayers to it. The mental image makes you grin. Then again, maybe that was the point. Some of the writings get surprisingly deep. One text compares the spiral of a snail shell to the winding path of the human soul toward grace. Another equates the snail's seasonal retreat into hibernation with spiritual withdrawal during Lent. To be still, it reads, is not to be dead. It is to be waiting. That one gets under your skin a little. You hear a soft clink and turn to see Fra Bartolomeo placing a snail on a small wooden pedestal beside an open window. Sunlight hits the shell, illuminating it like stained glass. He leans forward and murmurs, "She always prefers morning light." You don't ask the snail's name. You don't have to. Some scholars now believe these monastic snail contemplations were not meant to be literal theology, but rather meditative allegory. A way to slow the mind, soften the breath, and practice presence. Still, the line between metaphor and obsession blurred. One monk was said to have refused his last rites until someone brought him his favorite snail to witness them. The snail did not comment. Eventually, you make your way back toward the door. The friars resume their quiet debates. The shell guard are planning a formal letter to the bishop. The spiralists are crafting a hymn. And the snails, they just move, 1 inch at a time. Not in protest, not in praise, just moving. Which, maybe, was always the lesson. You blink against the sun as you step out of the monastery's stone hush and into a burst of color and noise. The morning has ripened into midday, and a festival is underway in Siena's crowded piazza. You can smell roasted almonds, hear tambourines clattering, and spot banners snapping high above rows of merchant tents. But what draws your eye isn't the puppet show or the fig tarts. It's the roped-off area in the middle of the square, guarded by 2 very serious boys, holding sticks with snail insignias carved at the ends. Welcome to the main event, the snail races. A voice crackles through a brass cone. Signori e signore, place your bets. The Florence favorite, Lorenzo Sigint, returns to defend his trail. Yes, they've named them. Of course they have. Snail racing had begun as a parlor diversion, but grew, inevitably, into full-blown regional sport. These weren't your grandmother's garden snails. These were trained, fed exclusive diets of lettuce, pear, and, in some cases, wine-soaked breadcrumbs. Their shells were buffed before events. Some even wore crests painted in natural dyes for team identification. You find a spot among the crowd, shoulder to shoulder with gamblers, whispering nuns, and a tiny man in a bishop's hat who is definitely not a real bishop. The tension is palpable. 8 snails are placed delicately into a circular starting corral carved into the surface of a polished wooden platform. The crowd hushes. A boy with a bell steps forward and rings it once, and they're off. Or, well, they begin to consider movement. The crowd leans in as if watching a comet descend. Each snail starts its epic journey toward the edge of the circle, trailing behind it a streak of shimmer and potential. Lorenzo's second seems to have the edge. His handler claims he was fed fermented basil water this morning for agility. But right behind him slimes a dark horse, a snail named Maria del Rose, whose shell glints with flecks of mother-of-pearl. The whispers are wild. And then scandal. A lettucey leaf has been dropped. Not just any leaf, a warm one. Laced, it seems, with thyme oil. Lorenzo Sigegen pauses mid-stride and veers toward it, his progress halting. Gasps ripple through the crowd. Scent doping. Someone yells, aromatic interference. The judges converge. One of them sniffs the leaf dramatically. Another begins interrogating Lorenzo's handler. He swears it wasn't him. He blames Maria's team. Maria's handler, a barefoot teenager with the eyes of someone who's seen real betrayal, denies everything. Historians still argue whether this event, the time scandal of Siena, was genuine cheating or a carefully staged drama designed to attract Venetian patrons. One surviving letter from a Florentine race organizer notes, "The crowd demands corruption, even in slowness." Meanwhile, back on the board, a snail named Flavio, utterly ignored until now, crosses the finish line unnoticed. The crowd erupts only after someone points him out. Coins fly. Hats are thrown. The fake bishop faints. You follow the snails as they are retrieved, rinsed in wine tradition, supposedly for cleansing the spirit, and return to their little travel boxes. Wooden coffers lined with moss. A woman nearby clutches hers to her chest, whispering, "You did beautifully." As if to reassure a startled opera singer, the announcer declares Flavio the winner. His prize, a carved chestnut medallion bearing a spiral insignia, and a commemorative lettuce crown he won't even eat. Too tired, or perhaps wisely aloof, people begin to disperse. Bets are settled, grudges born, and somewhere in the alley behind the main square, a boy is already offering odds on tomorrow's rematch. You pause at a nearby stall where snail-themed souvenirs are sold. Brass snail whistles, snail-embroidered handkerchiefs, even a rather horrifying puppet that sings a ballad about a snail who becomes pope. The vendor swears it's based on a true dream. Snail racing, for all its pomp, reflected something deeper in the Renaissance spirit, a longing to make meaning out of anything, even slowness, even silence. It was sport, yes, but it was also metaphor, about patience, strategy, and the thrill of watching the inevitable play out with unbearable dignity. A scholar centuries later would call it the poetry of delay. Another, more sarcastically, called it a sport invented by bored aristocrats and tolerated by peasants too polite to leave. But the races endured for nearly 2 generations, until mechanical clocks made everyone obsessed with speed again. You step away as the platform is wiped clean and a new round of hopeful snails is prepared for tomorrow. Lorenzo Sisyent, you're told, will return. With better focus and no time, you leave the echo of the race behind as the festival fades into soft lute music and the clatter of carts rolling back over cobbled lanes. But your path now winds toward a quieter, more official quarter of the city, past a basilica, through a side alley scented with beeswax and ink. There, beneath a faded fresco of St. Augustine and a suspiciously smug-looking snail, you come to the doors of the Archivio Papale Minore. Yes, tonight, you are going to witness one of the strangest intersections of Renaissance religion and bureaucracy. Papal snail permits. Inside the archives, the scent is older than dust. Parchment stacked in oak drawers. Wax seals pressed against faded velvet ribbon. Candlelight flickers across iron scroll racks. A clerk in robes too large for his frame greets you with a tired nod. He has ink on his fingertips and a snail crawling slowly across the hem of his sleeve. Exotic breeds require documentation, he mutters, unprompted. You nod, because what else can you do? During the height of the snail craze, roughly 1465 to 1495, the Vatican found itself inundated with letters from nobles requesting approval to import non-native mollusks. Not because the Pope was an expert on gastropod genetics, but because technically anything considered curious or foreign to God's design had to be approved before it could be bred or publicly displayed. And so, you're shown the cabinet. One drawer opens with a creak, and inside are rolled scrolls labeled with neat copperplate, Spiot Ridgeback, Tunisian longshell, Illyrian storm spiral. Each petition includes not only the name and origin of the snails, but its diet, temperament, and intended use, usually decorative companionship, though one simply says muse. One nobleman, a count from Palermo, claimed his imported snail could predict earthquakes by curling 3 times and refusing food. He demanded ecclesiastical blessing to have it reside in his private chapel. The Vatican's response: so long as it does not contradict the sacraments. You try not to laugh. It feels impolite. Another permit, this one stamped in gold, grants the Duchess of Ravenna permission to keep 5 imported Levantine snails, provided she swears not to let them mingle with local breeds. The reason? Fear of shell pattern corruption. That's right. Mollusk miscegenation was apparently a concern for 15th century Italian clergy. Historians still argue whether the Vatican truly cared about snail breeding, or whether this was just an excuse to flex administrative control over every quirk of noble life. Some argue it was a low-level scribe's pet project that spiraled out of control. Others claim Pope Innocent VIII had a genuine fear of spiral-based divinations. Regardless, the paperwork piled up. You're shown a ledger from 1490 listing every known approved mollusk in Tuscany. Each entry includes a drawing of the snail's shell, its assigned patron saint, and inexplicably a personality score. One snail, nicknamed Beatrice, is ranked meek but resolute. Another, Francis, is labeled overly curious and unsuitable for procession. And yes, there were processions. On certain feast days, nobles would parade their prize snails in tiny glass lanterns through the streets, accompanied by music and poetry. But only if they had papal blessing. A rogue parade in Pisa was shut down when it was discovered that the lead snail, a luminous North African import, lacked the proper ecclesiastical paperwork. Snail smuggling was a thing. You flip through a complaint filed by a friar in Bologna, alleging that several unsanctioned mollusks had been spotted in the garden of a rival abbey. They moved suspiciously, he writes, and their shells bore no registered markings. The accused monastery responded with a sketch of the snails in question, annotated with little halos. The Vatican never ruled on the case. At the heart of it all, you realize, was a tug-of-war between absurdity and belief. People imbued snails with meaning, mystical, aesthetic, divine, and institutions tried, as always, to regulate that meaning, to give it form, to put it in a drawer and stamp it. And yet, you can't help but admire the devotion. The clerk sets a sealed box before you. Inside, a single parchment, brittle and faded, with a Medici crest at the top. It's a personal letter from Lorenzo himself, requesting permission to ship a rare breed of Anatolian snail from Constantinople for the comfort and meditation of my sister, who suffers greatly in winter. The note ends with, "May she find peace in its patience." You close the box gently. The snail on the clerk's sleeve has moved maybe 2 inches since you arrived. You thank him. He nods once, no farewell, just a satisfied hum. And as you step back into the Roman light, dapple through high clerestory windows, you realize something strange. Bureaucracy has never felt this tender. You emerge from the labyrinthine archive like a sleepwalker, trailing the scent of vellum and vinegar ink, only to be swept into something far less orderly. The air outside has changed. It's thicker now, charged with the low thrum of rivalry, the smell of trampled basil, overturned soil, and something unmistakably passive-aggressive. You've stepped directly into the middle of a snail-fueled garden feud. On one side of the hedge, the House of Bellafiore, known for their delicate white-lipped snails, and their imported trellises that whisper when the wind shifts. On the other side, the House of Castellani, proud breeders of rare obsidian-shelled snails whose foot trails shimmer like candle wax under moonlight. At issue, theft, allegedly. You duck as a clay pot explodes against a stone wall. A gardener curses in Tuscan dialect as he brandishes a trowel like a dueling dagger. Someone shouts, "They took the breeding pair," and someone else, very high-pitched, screams, "Check the lettuce." You peek through a clematis-draped archway just in time to witness the latest escalation in what historians now call the Garden Wars of 1492. And no, that's not a joke. Contemporary letters describe a series of retaliatory strikes between noble estates that included nocturnal snail egg thefts, sabotage of feeding troughs, and most scandalous of all, the release of carnivorous ground beetles into a rival's mossbed. It was war, but very, very slow. The Castellanis, known for their experimental diets including quince extract and, allegedly, rosewater steam baths, accused the Bellafiores of intellectual snail larceny, in short, idea theft. They claimed the Bellafiores had stolen their snail naming scheme and passed it off as their own during a recent festival showcase. You walk past a row of lettuce beds encased in netting, so fine it might have been stolen from a wedding veil. One of the Castellani boys, no older than 10, is carefully inspecting each snail's shell with a polished obsidian disc, checking for tiny notches, proof that his family's unique pattern of spiral etching hasn't been duplicated. Etching. Yes, you heard that right. During the height of the competition, some families took to lightly etching their snails' shells with distinct markers, never enough to harm the animal, but just enough to declare ownership. Patterns ranged from geometric swirls to miniature initials. One Medici cousin even claimed to have developed an invisible watermark using ground sapphire paste and sunlight exposure. Historians still argue whether that technique ever worked or if it was, as one scholar later wrote, just another excuse to sunbathe near a moss patch and call it innovation. Back in the garden, one of the Castellanis pulls back a curtain of grapevine and reveals a secret enclosure, a low-walled amphitheater of soil and stone, where the rarest snails are housed. These include the much-coveted storm-shell breed grayish with a hint of lavender, known to spiral in reverse and move only at dusk. Or so the rumor goes. The Bellafiores, not to be outdone, have retaliated by unveiling a new strain they call Angelo del Vento. A pale, nearly translucent breed allegedly descended from snails found on an alpine pilgrimage route. They weep when it rains, claims the matriarch, and pray before moving. You're not entirely sure that last part holds up, but again, here, myth and biology blur constantly. The most extraordinary discovery today, however, lies not in the snails themselves, but in the espionage. You duck into a gazebo and overhear hushed voices. Two Castellani girls are unrolling a map of the Bellafiore estate. One whispers, "They planted false eggs." The other gasps, "Those monsters." It's true. False egg sabotage was a real tactic. One disgruntled former gardener, writing anonymously in a Milanese pamphlet, confessed to placing marble-sized beads into rival snail enclosures to disrupt breeding cycles and cause unnecessary fuss. It ruined an entire spring season, he wrote, and their best breeder refused to eat for days. Some say the Vatican tried to intervene, that a papal emissary was sent to negotiate a truce, only to be chased out by an angry grandmother wielding a watering can. Others believe the feud only truly ended after both families' prize snails mysteriously vanished on the same night, an event known now as La Grande Fuga delle Chiocciole, the Great Snail Escape. No culprits were named, though a third family, the Luzzattis, mysteriously expanded their snail pavilion the following week. Coincidence? You stand still for a moment in the middle of this chaos. Above you, roses sway in the breeze. Below, snails move patiently across the battlefield, unaware of their role in generational vendettas. And maybe that's what makes it so quietly ridiculous, and so, somehow, beautiful. Because here, between rosemary hedges and turf walls, entire philosophies were fought over. Patents on slowness, treatises on shell purity, the right to say, "My snail sparkles just a little more than yours," all over something that never once asked for attention. You slip out of the garden before the next round of trowel diplomacy begins, ducking under a trellis and into the cool shadows of a villa's back corridor. Here, the drama feels older. The walls are damp, the candles smoky, and the air carries the hush of whispered scandal. Because tonight, you're not just hearing about rivalries. Tonight, you're hearing about a crime, the Great Shell, theft of 1498. It begins, appropriately, with a locked cabinet. You're led down a hallway to a private study, where an aging archivist, half-blind and entirely convinced as this still matters, unlocks a chest with 3 rusted keys. Inside, a bundle of letters, all wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. He opens the first with trembling fingers and begins to read. On the 4th night of November, the pavilion was breached. The snails were gone. All 60, even Beatrice. You feel the weight in that last name? Beatrice was no ordinary snail. She was, according to surviving documents, the most prized specimen in all of Tuscany, an alabaster-shelled gastropod with a perfect Fibonacci spiral, bred over 5 generations, and said to glow faintly under moonlight. Her shell was engraved with the Medici motto in microscript so small it required a lens to see, and someone stole her. Along with 59 others, all rare breeds, all vanished overnight. The guards were found asleep, though whether drugged or simply incompetent remains a point of debate. The garden gate was unlatched, A trail of crushed lavender led to the outer wall, and the next morning, the snails were gone. No ransom, no notes, just the faintest smudge of slime trailing off into the woods. You lean forward as the archivist reveals sketches from the original investigation. There are diagrams of the snail enclosures, crime scene annotations, even a suspect list. 2 former gardeners, 1 disgraced monk, and a foreign merchant with a suspicious fondness for herb satchels. One detail leaps out. A footprint, small, narrow, unshoed, left in damp soil near the feeding trays. Some believe it was a child, others a servant girl with a grudge. But a particularly fringe theory that the snails escaped. A pamphlet printed the following spring titled La Marcia Notturna, the Night March, claimed that Beatrice led the others in a coordinated exodus, drawn by a scent only they could detect. It was satire, probably. But people talked. Some even claimed to see snails with similar markings in the fields outside Perugia weeks later, though no proof ever emerged. Historians still argue whether the theft was an inside job or the work of an elite collector trying to corner the gastropod market. One theory posits that the Luzzati family, yes, the same family who mysteriously expanded their snail pavilion, were involved, but nothing was ever proven. What's strangest is how mourned the event was. The theft wasn't seen as petty larceny. It was considered a violation of beauty, of lineage, of slowness itself. A poet wrote an entire sonnet cycle titled Elegy for Beatrice, each line dragging like a wet ribbon of grief. One verse reads, "She left no shell behind, only the silence of rosemary undone." A bit much, honestly, but sincere. In the months that followed, snail security across noble homes intensified. Enclosures were reinforced with copper netting. Watch snails larger. Slower snails known for hissing when disturbed were placed near entrances. Yes, that's a real thing. Or at least, people believed it was. The incident also birthed the brief rise of the candlelight notturni, or snail watchmen. Young men paid to patrol estates with lanterns and soft shoes, listening for suspicious rustles. One group even developed a code system involving moss placement to indicate whether snails had been tampered with. They lasted 1 season. Too many turned out to be the thieves themselves. Back in the villa study, the archivist folds the last letter and sighs. They were never found, he says, but sometimes I dream of them, crossing the hills, still moving. You smile. Because that's the kind of madness you've grown fond of in this world, where even theft carries elegance, and loss is measured in centimeters per minute. As you leave, the archivist presses a copy of the Beatrice sonnet into your hand, in case, he says, you ever need to remember how quiet heartbreak can be. Outside, the sky has turned dusky lavender, and somewhere out there, maybe in a forgotten grove, beneath a fig tree older than memory, a snail moves, slowly, deliberately, without witness. Carrying a spiral of secrets on its back, you follow a narrow garden path under the weight of dusk, where the last rays of light catch on wrought iron signs and chipped snail figurines nailed to doorways. There's a tavern ahead, half hidden behind ivy, half remembered by history books. Inside, the floor creaks like it's keeping secrets. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and something vaguely herbal, like mint, left too long in a cup. But this is no ordinary inn. This is the gathering place of the Snail Fanciers Guild. You find yourself in the back room. Long wooden tables stained with wine, candlelight flickering off tankards, and the walls crowded with hand-painted snails, framed like saints. These are the serious ones, the lifers, the whisperers, the collectors who don't just love snails, they compete with them. A brawny man with half a mustache raises a mug and bellows, "Weight class." We said, "You brought a long shell to a ridgeback match." The room erupts in protest. Welcome to the world of competitive snail showing. Historians often overlook this subculture, but the records are there in private letters, tournament flyers, even a 1496 expense log, noting 6 copper medals for gastropod evaluation. Yes, medals, engraved, often misspelled. The rules were surprisingly rigorous. A snail was judged on shell integrity, pattern clarity, foot resilience, a subjective category. Let's be honest, and behavioral elegance defined here as the grace with which the snail reorients itself after being turned. Competitions last hours, sometimes days. One pamphlet, De Artificio Chiocciolai, outlines the proper presentation form. The snail must be placed on a slab of polished marble, offered a choice of herbs, and timed from first movement to selected destination. The herbs, mind you, had to be arranged in a spiral. You sit near two men in hooded cloaks, purely aesthetic, who are huddled over a parchment diagram of a snail display arena. They're arguing about lighting angles. Too much glare, and the shell looks fake. One says, too little, and the foot looks lethargic. It's also delightfully absurd. You're offered a small plate of rosemary bread and a seat next to Lucrezia, a retired champion snail trainer. She introduces herself by rolling up her sleeve to reveal a tattoo, a perfect spiral with the words, Tenax et pulchra, persistent and beautiful. Her best snail, she tells you, was named Viola. She had symmetry. She had stillness. She once won 3 rounds without moving more than a fingernail's length. You nod solemnly. That sounds impressive. Lucrezia shows you her prize, a silver pin in the shape of a snail holding a laurel. It's heavy, real silver. From the Siena Invitational, she says, 1491. Before the cheating scandal, of course there was a cheating scandal, apparently. One handler was caught applying olive oil to a competitor's shell to make it gleam under torchlight. It worked. Too well. The reflection blinded a judge who then disqualified the wrong snails. Chaos ensued. A lute was broken. That year's trophies were never awarded. Historians still argue whether the guild survived that year intact or split into rival factions. Some say it was the moment the sport went underground. Others believe it was the start of snail minimalism, a purist revival movement that rejected shell adornment entirely. You notice a small board near the bar listing names. Benedetta the Bold, Old Paolo, 3-foot Nicolo, not a height reference, he just trained 3-footed snails. Each name has a tally of wins next to it, and underneath, etched in wine-stained ink, grace, grit, goo. You smile. That could have been the motto of the whole era. A bell rings, and the crowd gathers around a central table. 2 snails are placed on a velvet mat. One is a ridgeback, wide and speckled. The other, a lithe longshell with spiral ridges like a coiled ribbon. The judges, former champions, wearing snail-shaped medallions, nod solemnly. A finger is raised. A silence falls, and they're off. Or they think about it. You realize that this is less about the outcome than the ritual. The slowness is the point. The attention, the absurd gravity given to creatures who never ask to be famous. In this moment, surrounded by the smell of old beer and rosemary and snail polish, it feels like something sacred. Lucrezia leans in and says, "People think we're strange, but we understand something." "What's that?" you ask. She looks at the motionless snails, eyes soft. That patience isn't a lack of movement, it's choosing when to move. You sit with that for a while. The match ends in a draw. Everyone applauds, and as the candles flicker lower, and old champions raise one last toast, you can't help but feel, maybe they're right. Maybe everything fast has already been forgotten. But the slow things, they linger. You wake to the smell of ironed linen and sweet oil, the sound of distant bells striking the afternoon hour. The world feels slower today. Warmer. You pass under sun-dappled archways and through open market lanes where flowers wilt gently in clay pots, their petals curling like miniature scrolls. And then you see her, a street vendor with a wide-brimmed hat, humming to herself as she arranges small glass bottles on a faded silk cloth. Each bottle glows faintly. Inside, snail slime, labeled with careful script. "Welcome to the world of Renaissance snail cosmetics." You stop to look. She beams. "For the skin," she says, pressing a cool vial into your hand. "For the soul, for the softening of judgment." She's not kidding. In 15th century Italy, snail slime was the miracle balm of the moment. Vendors like her could be found in every city square from Florence to Ferrara, peddling concoctions said to brighten the complexion, ease joint pain, and even ward off spiritual decay. One particularly enthusiastic herbalist claimed it could make the face glow as if kissed by an angel, but also keep your neighbors from envying you. It didn't stop there. You browse through her display. Pomata di lumaca per rughe profonde. Deep wrinkle. Snail cream. Balsamo del mattino morning. balm, collected before sunrise. Unguento de Santi, the saint's ointment, rumored to be blessed by monks who raise snails in silence, and next to all that, a separate display. Tiny carved snail figures wearing halos. Fashion, she says. Because yes, snail-inspired fashion was real. You walk further into the market and see it everywhere now that you're looking. Necklaces with spiral pendants, spiral-threaded embroidery along sleeves, even hairpins shaped like gently coiled mollusks. A young woman walks by in a gown stitched with silver snail motifs that shimmer like moonlight when she turns. You overhear her whispering to a friend, "It's for canonization." They say if you wear the spiral when praying for a miracle, it strengthens the request. Of course, someone made that up. But here, belief and beauty are practically the same currency. The rise of snail-inspired fashion didn't just come from aesthetics. It was also a quiet rebellion. In a society where women were often expected to be still, quiet, and contained, the snail became an odd kind of symbol, slow but unstoppable, soft but shielded. You pass by a stall selling rings etched with miniature spiral shells worn on the pinky, never the ring finger, to signify independence. One vendor shows you a brooch depicting a snail sliding past a tower. It means survival, he says, the slow escape. You think he's joking? He's not. Historians still argue whether this mollusk-inspired trend was rooted in mystical beliefs, medicinal marketing, or proto-feminist codes. Maybe all of it, maybe none. Maybe fashion, like slime, finds its own trail. You take a seat on a bench near the plaza fountain, watching as a small crowd gathers around a woman giving testimonials. Her skin gleams like polished marble. She says she's used snail balm every morning since her third miscarriage and claims it saved her spirit. "I lost something," she says, voice shaking. "And then I remembered how slowly the world is allowed to heal." A younger girl beside her clutches a wooden snail charm and whispers, "Mine sings to me. I don't hear words, but I feel calmed." You nod. You get it now. It's not just balm, not just brooches. It's the act of honoring softness in a world that worships speed. Some take it further. You're told about a widow outside Mantua who claims her snail predicted a local priest's death by not touching his favorite basil. About a seamstress in Genoa who says she stitches better if a snail is watching from her windowsill. About a dying poet who insisted her final verses be read aloud to the garden, so the snails may carry them away. Fringe. Absolutely. But also deeply human. As the market begins to close, the vendor presses a small bottle into your palm. The label reads, "Olio del Perdono," oil of forgiveness. She doesn't explain it. She doesn't need to. You tuck it away, just in case. And as the wind stirs the scented awnings and turns the sky to honey, you walk with a little more intention, a little more quiet. The kind of quiet that shimmers. The sky softens as you walk, fewer people now, fewer sounds. Just the low rustle of trees shedding warmth, the lazy flap of a laundry line, and the distant chime of a convent bell, marking an hour nobody's rushing to meet. You pass through a garden gate no longer guarded, its paint chipped, its hinges sighing. Beyond it, the abandoned pavilion of what was once the Florentine Society for Gastropod Advancement. You've arrived at the twilight of the Craze. The snail theaters are still here, rows of tiny marble arenas under latticed trellises, their moss beds long dry. You wander between the rows. The silence feels deeper here, not because no one is speaking, but because so many once did. This was where nobles gathered for nightly viewings, where poets whispered verses as their snails climbed miniature columns, where artists displayed shell etchings in glass boxes lit by fireflies. Now, it's quiet. You find an overturned snail chaise behind a hedge, its velvet lining faded, silver thread unraveled. A plaque near the main path reads, "In honor of Viola, champion of the spring trials, 1488. Her engraved shell is missing. A gardener emerges from a shed, older, wiser, covered in green dust and holding no illusions. "You're late," he says, not unkindly. "The snails are gone." You nod. He offers you a cracked teacup with mint tea, then gestures to the drying moss. They started fading after the parrot boom. Ah yes, the parrot boom. Around the mid-1490s, European traders began bringing bright birds from the tropics. They talked, they danced, They matched the tapestries, and suddenly, slowness wasn't fashionable anymore. Snail salons closed. The guild splintered. Portraits were retouched to remove shell companions. The statues remained, but the meaning drifted. People wanted spectacle now. Color, motion. The gardener leans on his rake. They say it's progress, he mutters. But sometimes I think we just got louder. You help him clear a row of empty snail huts. Each is still labeled faint ink on wood. Isabetta, Cosimo, Lucia, Donatella. Little names that once carried stories, love letters, belief. And yet, something lingers. He shows you a journal from a former member of the Snail Fanciers Guild. Most of the pages are ordinary lists of feed mixtures, sketches of shells, but near the end, there's a single entry in a slower hand. They have left us, not in anger, but in fulfillment. We were always the guests, they always the patient. You sit in the shell-shaped bench near the sundial. The shadow moves slower than a breath, and then he tells you the last real story. A young noblewoman unnamed who, upon learning that the snail she had raised for 6 years had passed, dressed in mourning for a week. She lit candles. She buried it in a walnut box beneath a fig tree and wrote, "You taught me everything I forgot to ask." Historians still argue whether she was grieving the snail or herself. You stand, now, and look out over the empty pavilion. The stone has warmed slightly in the sun. A breeze moves the ivy on the far wall. Nothing else stirs, and it's okay. Because nothing needs to. Sometimes, a thing ends without falling. It just slows. Until one day, no one quite remembers when it stopped. Just that it did. And the world went on. Faster. But maybe not better. The gardener waves you off with a tired smile. If you see one, he says, give it a little space. They like that. And you walk away through the low gate, trailing thoughts like spirals, knowing you won't forget this place even if everyone else already has. The museum is colder than expected. Its walls are white, its lighting precise. You walk slowly, your footsteps muffled by polished stone, past glass cases and touchscreens, audio guides, and quietly humming vents. And there it is, in a case near the back. Beneath a panel that reads Ephemeral Obsessions of the Renaissance, sits a single snail shell, small, pale, iridescent, etched faintly with the Medici crest almost invisible now. The lighting is angled just right, so you can see the spiral glisten, like a fingerprint in marble. A label reads, Beatrice, c. 1490, Florentine bread, Helix pomatia, shell engraving, devotional crest, pigment traces unknown, believed to be the final known specimen from the Medici Snail Pavilion, donated anonymously, 1891. You stand there longer than expected. People pass behind you, school children dragging backpacks, a couple quietly arguing over where to get lunch. But for a moment, it is just you and her. Beatrice. She doesn't say much, but she never needed to. You think of everything that led to this glass box, the velvet pouches, the racing scandals, the monk debates, the embroidered gowns, the heartbreaks, the poems, the oil of forgiveness. You wonder who made the decision to donate her shell, to put it behind glass, to say, this mattered. Remember it? Historians still argue whether Beatrice was the real Beatrice. Some believe she was simply the best preserved shell with a noble crest, retroactively claimed. Others believe the engraving technique was too specific to be replicated, proof that she is who they say she is. But standing here, under cool museum lights, it doesn't really matter. Because she's not just a shell, she's a reminder of a time when people slowed down, when beauty lived in inches, when care wasn't broadcast but whispered into moss-lined boxes, when someone could love something for its stillness, and that love would be returned. Not with affection, but with presence. You read the final sentence on the plaque. The shell bears no inscription beyond the crest, but the spiral itself is an unspoken text, a poem without words, a silence that endured. You close your eyes, and there, beneath your breath, you whisper, thank you. And now, as you settle under the covers, the lights dimmed, the world outside softened to a hush. Let it all slow down with you. Let your thoughts trace that spiral, not in a hurry, not to finish, just to follow the curve. Breathe gently now, as if your breath is something small and deliberate, like a snail crossing a garden at dawn. Each inhale is a pause. Each exhale, a step. You remember the quiet gardens? The lavender-scented salons, the absurd snail races, and the monastic debates whispered under candlelight. You remember velvet pouches, tiny carriages, and engraved shells placed gently in palms like sacred little secrets. And through it all, the slow, glistening trail of something soft and patient and entirely without malice. A world where stillness wasn't shameful, where waiting was meaningful, where even silence had a name. Let your body relax into that. Let your shoulders sink. Let your jaw go slack, because tonight, you don't have to hurry. There's nowhere you need to be but here. There's nothing you need to solve. No scroll to interpret. No medal to win. No shell to polish. Just this moment, this breath, this spiral of slowness. And maybe, just maybe, when you wake tomorrow, the world will still be fast, still be loud, still be eager to press forward. But you'll carry a little of the slowness with you. Not as armor, not as protest, but as proof that you remember that you were once a guest. In the quiet kingdom of the snails, sleep well,